walked in and Joe said, right, who's the bloke who spent 15,000 quid of our money? Better work. I was like, whoa! Steve was less in the studio. He was initially at the beginning of the album, but then as it progressed, less, and then he kind of was in rehab. I actually played a guitar on Let's Get Rocked, which is a little known fact. Did I get a credit? No.
Welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in. Now, if you're a big Def Leppard fan like I am, then I'm sure you already recognize the name and can sense and share my excitement as well. Involved with the albums Adrenalize, Retroactive, Vault, Slang, Euphoria and X, or 10 if you prefer, with liner notes credits ranging from engineering, mixing, producing, songwriting, and even instrumentation. A man who was there and helped bring us the music of one of the most productive and diverse periods of the band's history. Outside of Def Leppard, a fascinating career with beginnings in assistant engineering and Fairlight programming for the likes of Bucks Fizz and Cutting Crew, on to mixing for one of Germany's biggest selling artists, Herbert Grönemeyer. Becoming a successful songwriter in his own right, penning hits for Simply Red and Cliff Richard, currently still writing and producing for his own production company, and recently being appointed a council member of the Performing Rights Society of Music. Not only all of that, but a bloody nice bloke as well. It's a pleasure to be chatting here with Pete Woodroffe. Thank you so much again for agreeing to do this.
That sounds quite good, actually. Good obituary.
I'm glad. I was trying to make sure I covered all the points there. But yeah, I mean, like I say, we've talked briefly on the phone, and you gave me 3 or 4 amazing little Def Leppard stories in that short space of time. So I'm sure we're gonna cover some real exciting things for the fans out there.
There are quite a lot of Def Leppard stories. I guess the disclaimer would be that my decade with them started in 1989. So it started assisting and engineering and programming on Adrenalize, by which time Pyromania and Hysteria were done. So I can't dish the dirt on those. Not that I'm dishing any dirt.
Of course, yeah. So I think what would maybe be cool to talk about first is maybe just a little bit of a background of how you got into the industry and how you ended up working with Def Leppard, because it's quite an interesting story.
Yeah, I'd done a degree in factories and machine tools, production engineering, and I'd kind of not done a year out, and I tricked my parents into saying, look, I'm just going to try music for a year. And I got a job as a tape op in the guy who'd just written and produced Bucks Fizz, who'd had 3 number ones and 1 Eurovision, and like very pop. But Andy, their producer, was great. He went on and wrote Think Twice for Celine Dion and was a sort of pop writer, wrote for Il Divo, lots of people. Anyway, he had a studio that he just built, and he walked into his office and said, who can I get to work for me for nothing? And his secretary went, well, there's a guy here. I'd literally just written him a letter saying, Dear Andy. So I started working there down in Lingfield in Surrey. And for the first 3 years, it was a very kind of basic studio. And then he invested money in it, and it became a big SSL mixing desk. And we had Fairlights and Lin 9, all the kind of cool keyboards plumbed in. And it was great. And I was there for, 5 years in total. But the last 2 years were with this fantastic studio. Anyway, so the last 2 years in the studio were really fairly full on. We had people in every day working, because it was residential. Everyone would stay and work till like 2 or 3 in the morning. So and during that time, I was a huge fan of an album called Steve McQueen, Two Wheels Good in America, but by a band called Prefab Sprout.
Yeah.
And one day, this guy Mike Shipley came in to mix a song, just like on a session, a record for a record company thing. And I was like, oh my God, Mike Shipley, you mixed Prefab Sprout, Steve McQueen. So we got on like a house on fire. And I was at the time I was thinking of leaving. I'd been there 5 years and I was getting a bit mad. And so when I left, I wrote to Mike and said, I actually found the letter the other day, Dear Michael. And and just, if you're producing now, if you need someone to engineer and program, I'm there. And I then did an album in Germany with Herbert, and then Mike got in touch with me and said, yeah, look, Def Leppard. And that's how it started.
Brilliant. So that time period, so that would have been around 88, 89?
Yeah, I think 88 was when we initially hooked up with the band. And it was funny because Mike had said, right, what we need is a rack with sampling stuff in it, to do drum triggering, because at the time we were program stuff, and he played pads when he played stuff in the studio. So we wanted a sequencer, and it all should be rack mounted, and which I did and ordered it all. And I actually hadn't used the sequencer. It was what became Logic, but then was C-Lab Notator and an Atari computer. And I hadn't had a chance to use it. I've been using other sequencers at that point. So the rack mounting and the flight cases took so long. I ended up in a room in Holland with all this gear on a Friday. I think it arrived. And I had until Monday to check it all worked. And I was thinking, what happens if Rick comes in and plays a kit and goes, oh no, there's a delay, I can't use this. Anyway, so I was really, really nervous, and Mike said, oh, we're going to meet the band. And I was meeting them for the first time. They were just in a rehearsal room. So he walked in, and Joe said, right, who's the bloke who spent 15,000 quid of our money? Better work. And I was like, whoa! but luckily it did.
Like you're saying there, the rehearsal, was that over in Holland at all? Or was that?
Yeah, that was in Holland. That was all, yeah. And we started initially at Vislord, which is, which, I mean, they just come off the Hysteria tour. They had almost no time off at all. And they were back in Vislord Studios, the same place they'd recorded Hysteria, in the same room with the same kind of slightly dirty carpets. And, it was not a brand new studio. But Vislord had built next door this fantastic studio with a new mixing desk and all lovely carpets that basically Def Leppard had paid for. And they were a bit like, back to work. So it was kind of a bit of a downer, and we fairly swiftly moved to a place called Studio 150 in Amsterdam, which was lovely for a couple of months, and that was off a canal and just was really nice. And during that time, Joe said, I've just bought a house in Dublin, maybe I should put a studio in there. And we just said, yeah, great idea. So then we had a break, and the studio was built, and it took a while, but anyway, the studio was built first, and the rest of the house was a building site, and we started work there. Oh
wow! So with that studio in Amsterdam, I believe Def Leppard released a documentary in '89, the BBC, and there's a little clip of Phil recording some stand-up Kick Love Into Motion. So would that have been the Amsterdam studio? Wow. Okay, it's kind of good to get a bit of a chronological time period of seeing these things and thinking, okay, so it was around that time, right? So then
it was on a canal called Lauriegracht, and there was a door, like a big wooden door, and just a little door-sized door you went through, and then down through a little garden bit into the studio hidden away at the back, and it was a great place.
Wow,
it was really good. And it was also, it kind of what was as the summer was beginning in Holland, and suddenly everyone was outside bars and people on bicycles, and it was a fun time.
Great.
But then we were off to Dublin.
Okay. So that kind of period in '88, was that maybe like the writing period for Adrenalize? Do you know if they had most of the album or some of the album under the belt?
The writing was pretty much done. Most of the songs had been written and demoed before my time at Mutt's, with Mutt. I'm not sure where. And so they do a couple of days on each song. Tonight was definitely written. Yeah, they're all written pretty much. I think Let's Get Rocked was the only one that Mutt came over right at the end of the album. He worked on that for a bit. How did we spend 3 years working on an album?
Oh yeah, I was just about to say, because when Mike asked you to work, I'm sure I've got a quote from you where he said he was like, 6 months, the album will be done.
Yeah, he said it'd be 6 months, and because I said, oh, Def Leppard, didn't their last album take 3 years? Because when I was in England, people would be working in Dublin and coming back and say, yeah, Def Leppard's still working there. It's like, what, the same album, yeah? So they had a kind of reputation already. So I was a little nervous, but you always think, and there was no point during Adrenalize that we didn't think it would be done in a few months. It was always,
oh wow, right,
it could be done, but it never was. It was,
Could you give us an insight with the idea of the work ethic? Because I think people maybe get the wrong impression that if an album's taking that long to do,
there wasn't much partying. We worked from 10 a.m. Till midnight, 6 days a week. We'd have Saturdays off. There was a break in the middle. But at the end of the first year, there was a kind of pause, and everyone said, that doesn't really sound kind of right. And Mike said, so what, we'd been using Randall guitar amps, which were the band had an endorsement with, and Mike said so, and the demos had been done with them with Mark, so the original sounds on the demos were Randall. Mike said, so on his stereo, because Mike had only mixed his stereo, so what amps did he use on that? Was that Randall? And Phil was like, no, it wasn't Randall at all. We used Rockman's, and I can see behind you a John Hornby Skew's Rockbox. So it's mainly that, with a bit of Gallion Kruger. So, okay. And I think Rick Allen said to me that he called me Teflon, because at that point it's like, okay, well, let's just redo the guitars then. And as we spent a year doing pretty much just guitars.
Wow.
It was right. Using Randall's was not a great idea. It just didn't sound right for Def Leppard. They sound great as guitar amps, but
with the type of chord voicings and layering that Def Leppard do, you need something a bit cleaner that the Rockman could provide.
Even the Marshalls, especially when you have like a chorus, a Def Leppard chorus will have a pair of, everything's kind of double tracked. It'll be a pair of root note guitars, a pair of an arpeggio part, a pair of chords, a counter melody. So you get 24 tracks of guitars if you have 12 different parts. Yeah. And if they're all for a Marshall or a Randall, you get this kind of horrid build up of even with the Rockmans and the rock boxes, a lot of what was done was subtractive equalization, if that means anything. So we had a Uri 565 notch filter, which has two frequencies, and you can make them really narrow, and you just sweep through the sound of the guitar, and at a certain point you'll go, oh, that's excruciating, and you dip that. And if you do that, not too much on the frequencies that are really offensive. We also had a Clark Technic multi-band graphic, a DN, I wrote it down, DN360. And so a lot of it was taking out the offensive frequencies. Phil's talked about this, no big secret. And then you can get this sort of tapestry of guitars that go, whoa, and sound great.
When you're adding guitars and guitars like that, how did you guys know, oh yeah, that's it? It blows my mind how you guys would make a decision on something like that.
Well, obviously, we didn't make them that quickly because it took a while. There was also, the whole of any success that you're following up is always a challenge. Once you've, any pop band, when you have a hit record and you're trying to make something that's as good, it's difficult. Hysteria was a massive record, it sold 20 million copies. So, and Mart wasn't in the room. Mart had done the demo, co-written some of the songs of the band, most of the songs. But there was a lot of second guessing, if you like, and is it good enough? And so, yeah, but the sound, Hysteria took a long time to make. It takes a long time to do that. It is a fantastic thing. And you just solo the guitar with a Def Leppard record. It's like, wow. Bear in mind that Adrenalize was all done. It was the last record I did really before Pro Tools. So Pro Tools means you can now, I was talking to a friend of mine, an engineer today, a producer, and he was saying how kids today, they don't appreciate it. It's so easy now to spin things in, to change the timing. Back then, when you're going ching, 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 no, it's got to be absolutely tight. And then when you're tracking things up, also, the more you microscope in, if the drums are absolutely like a metronome, again, the drums were done last. So everything was done to just do, and a programmed hat. And if that's your basics, there's no looseness at all. It's not forgiving. So to get the feel, to get it sound really good. There was a lovely story of when they did, I think I told you on the phone, when they did Pyromania, I think it was Pyromania, it might have been earlier, Nigel Green had spent a couple of weeks getting the sound with a 4x12 speaker, getting the mics all perfect, and he had like 3 mics on it and getting them all out in the right phasing. Sounded great. So it was, by the time they got it perfect, it was a Friday evening. So, okay, let's start the guitars on Monday. And they came in on Monday, and someone had been let into the studio area to do a photo shoot, and a model had sat on the 4x12 and moved all the mics.
Oh, geez.
So, the joy of the Palmer speaker simulator, I happen to have one right here,
wow.
Was that, so even though we're using Rockmans, they would often be fed through a power amp into a speaker simulator. So but there were no microphones involved in the guitars. It was all done using that. But even then, I was actually looking yesterday in my attic to find, I have a folder, an A4 folder this thick, which was the guitar sounds on Adrenalize. So every song, every guitar, or most of the guitar sounds I would write down the plectrum, the guitar lead, the crocodile clip lead going from the whammy bar to the earth. So every single cable, and then into a Boss compressor pedal, then into the power amp, and then the speaker simulator, then into an AMEC EQ, then a notch filter. So we'd have exactly written down all the settings. So in theory, we could get back to a sound like a year later. Never really worked though, because you come back and guitars sound different. But it helped to a degree.
Could you maybe give an insight for people who aren't maybe as familiar with the recording process, or how Def Leppard would go about it? I mean, traditionally bands would go in and maybe lay down a backing track together as a band and then just do little overdubs. Could you maybe go over what you guys did with Adrenalize?
So Adrenalize, the songs were written. It was a question of, we had the drums programmed as a basic guide drums. We would have a basic guide synth. Guitars were done, as I said, part by part. Let's work on the chorus today and getting it good. And also, a lot of the muck thing is you finish in the evening going, yeah, fantastic. You come back the next day and you listen to it really objectively and you think, could be better. And so, and instead of going, oh, it'll be fine, you make it better. And whether it's a verse section or a bridge section, guitars, backing vocals, you just work on it. It was on Euphoria later, we were doing, I think it was Paper Sun, I might be wrong. Anyway, we had a little studio upstairs, and either Ronan or Joe McDonald was recording vocals up there while I was downstairs doing the tracks. And we'd spent ages doing these chorus backing vocals. And there's like, the Def Leppard backing vocal sound is the main melody done maybe 20 times by Phil, or Mart had done the guide vocals on Adrenalize. So you'd have that as a basis, and then that would be tracked another 20 tracks with someone else like Sav. Normally it was certainly later on, it would be Sav, Viv and Phil would do the root, and then you'd have the high part and then a higher part and then a low part, and each of them would have 20 tracks. So it's like huge. Anyway, we'd spend a whole weekend doing all these backing vocals, and then Sav goes, oh, would it be better if the lyric was, and it's like, okay. So yeah, a lot of resilience was needed, because you're constantly honing it and improving it. And if it's going to get better, you go, well, yeah, that is way better, so let's do that.
It's a very interesting period for the band. I think you touched on before about taking a bit too long to get the album done. I mean, a lot goes on it during the recording.
If we banged it out in 6 months, it would have, that would have been that was the original plan. But of course, Steve had his alcohol problems and then died, which was horrendous, and made, again, that whole process was real life intruding, and making, it's quite hard to be. I actually just looked at Phil's book, because this is all 30 years ago, and he was saying how it was an awful time, terrible time. So and so this album, it took longer than it should have done, and when it came out, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, music had changed. When the album did okay, it did.
Well, yeah, it came in at #1 here in the UK and I think America as well. I mean,
5 million copies is.
You mentioned Steve there, and you mentioned the quote. I was going to quote you from your little appearance on Behind the Music with about your real life intruding, and something I think as a diehard fan, when you watch these documentaries, you always want to hear like more of these interviews, because for me that sounded like you're in quite a philosophical moment, and you've only got like a little 5-second bit. So it's like, I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that a little bit more, on how Steve was, and how much you saw of him in the studio, and how there's another quote from yourself about, you guys, you all knew about the problem, but it was still such a shock and a surprise when he did pass.
Yeah, I think that, when I arrived at the beginning of Adrenalize, there was a drink problem. In Phil's book, he talks about him, having the shakes and going, hey, what's going on here? And Phil also stopping the drink. That kind of, you don't stop drinking unless you're drinking too much, I guess. But it did. We're in Dublin. Steve was less in the studio. he was initially at the beginning of the album, but then as it progressed, less, and then he kind of was in rehab, and yeah, and so, but it was really awful, you know, to have a guy age 30 who's peak of success, and you know, Steve's contribution to Def Leppard, the guitar parts, as you know, it's you can't. It was so massive, and yet he was, you know, had huge issues. Working in studios, you create a fun, hey, let's make a record and let's work till, you know, 2 in the morning, and it's, you can't really do that when everyone in the room is well aware that there's someone who isn't there and who is really going through a terrible time. And then when he passed away, that was, you know.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you think about, you know, like the kind of resilience that the band must have had to carry on. I mean, if you can make comparisons to the likes of Queen or even Led Zeppelin, feeling as though, well, we can't. I mean, how was it in that initial period after?
I think there was that, and I think also it's like, what else? You know, it gives you a focus. Let's finish this record that Steve wrote and, you know, had all the parts from. I think, yeah. And then, right, we finished the record. What do we do now? So you'd have to ask them. I was the new guy who met Steve and went out for a drink with Steve, and then kind of I'd be back in the studio, but he was less present, I think, on Adrenalize, even at the beginning,
right,
than on Hysteria. He was around and played parts, but it was things weren't great.
Because of course, just before your quote on Behind the Music, Phil was talking about it's like, you bring up the faders and you hear Steve play and it's like a ghost, and you know, has to relearn the parts. So was that essentially, I mean, do you recall how much Steve is on the album at all, if Phil was having to redo a lot of his parts?
There was definitely solos and stuff, but I think the stuff we kept from that first year with the Randalls was Steve stuff.
Okay.
So, but I couldn't remember the exact.
It seems like for how Adrenalize comes out as well, and you think about the kind of 3 opening songs on it, you know, Let's Get Rocked and Heaven Is a Make Love Like a Man, it feels as though there's a little bit of a disconnect there with what went on with the band, and like you say, you know, using music as escapism, and there's something about Adrenalize which is just, it's just a weird time. I mean,
the songs were written before we started recording, so those songs were definitely on. White Lightning wasn't. White Lightning's a weird one because Mike Shipley had a baby, a miracle. No, his wife had a baby, and Ben, and that happened during the middle of the album, and it was like, he said, well, I've got to go and be in London and stuff, and so White Lightning was just me and the band. That was like, we did that without Mike pretty much. He mixed it, but yeah, and so that was more written on the album, and I think that's a slightly darker side to it. So that was about Steve, obviously.
Yeah, of course, yeah. So with that happening to Steve, and I guess with maybe with the awareness of what was happening, let's say Seattle, with the grunge thing, were you and the band kind of so far committed to these songs where it's like, well, these are the ones, there's definitely no chance of
kind of, and I think it was a bit head down and finished the record. I mean, I just remember locking myself in a room in Dublin at one point, like 2 years in, and just crying. It's like, how can this take 2 years? There was Mike Shipley at the mix said, how old are you, Pete? I said, I'm 30. He said, you're 30? I thought you were 27. I said, well, I was the last time you asked me, you know, on the same record. It was really a long haul.
Yeah.
There was a one little break when the end of the first year, when the Randalls Aren't Right thing happened. We had a pause. I can't remember why. Anyway, and Phil and I went off to Australia, and he and I finished off an album for a band called BB Steel. That were mates of his that he met on the tour, and that was fun and a laugh. I actually played a guitar on Let's Get Rocked, which is a little known fact. Did I get a credit? No. I raised one of Phil's, like, a chord, and he said, I'm not fucking playing it. Sorry, don't swear. I'm not playing it, and handed me the guitar, and he then dropped in, and and I had to play it. And I'm not a guitarist. I'm a much worse guitarist then than I am now, but I'm still a terrible guitarist. So that's.
Well, we might touch upon another non-guitarist who played with the band on Euphoria.
Yes, the great Damon Hill.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, everyone. Be sure to keep an eye out for part 2, where I'll be continuing my chat with Pete Woodroffe.
Presses play, and a mosquito had landed on one of the multi-track tape heads. Complete distortion for about a second on all the vocals. Suddenly went